A billionaire CEO turns down every wealthy socialite but unexpectedly falls for a humble food delivery girl. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy the story. Ethan Hayes, 34, was restless. Despite being at the most exclusive event in Charleston, surrounded by glamorous women dripping in designer labels, he couldn't shake the feeling of boredom. The idle chatter about yacht trips and rare watches only made him crave an escape. He was on the verge of making an excuse to leave when something startling happened. From across the room came a sudden, shocked cry. What on earth? Everyone turned toward the entrance. A highly respected man in a pristine ivory suit, a top executive from one of the city's major banks, was now drenched in a bright red drink. Standing awkwardly in front of him was a young woman in a simple t-shirt and jeans, holding a thermal bag labeled Pacific Walk Bistro. Her face turned pale as she froze mid-step. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you," she blurted out, frantically trying to dab at the stain with a napkin. Laughter broke out around the room at the chaotic sight. Who let someone like that in here? She probably thinks a tuxedo is a napkin. What a train wreck. Ivy, red-faced with embarrassment, could barely breathe. "I was just delivering takeout. The app must have given me the wrong address." The banker scowled, patting his soaked shirt with a cloth. "Get this girl out of here immediately." Before Ivy could respond, a security guard appeared and gripped her arm. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, stone-faced. She tried to pull away, but his hold was strong. "I swear, I'm not trespassing, I'm just delivering food." Then Ethan's voice rang out. "Let her go." The room went silent. Guests exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The banker's jaw tensed. "Ethan, you can't be serious. You're siding with her?" Ethan ignored the man completely and walked up to Ivy, arms folded. "What's your name?" he asked. "And why exactly are you here?" Ivy swallowed hard. The city's most powerful man was talking to her. "I'm Ivy," she said quietly. "I work at Pacific Walk Bistro. I do deliveries and the app must have sent me to the wrong building," she explained. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Is that the place with the spicy soba bowls?" Ivy blinked, unsure. "Yes, why?" That's when Ethan cracked a smile for the first time all evening. "So you're the one behind that legendary soba?" She scratched the back of her neck. "Well, not really. It's my grandmother's recipe. I just help cook." Ethan nodded, intrigued. "That's exactly what I need. I'm looking for a cook." Ivy froze. "Excuse me." The guests gasped. The banker's mouth dropped open. "Ethan, are you actually considering hiring her?" But Ethan remained unfazed. "I'll pay you 3 times what you're earning now." Ivy nearly choked. "Triple?" Her mind raced. That was life-changing money. But she thought about her grandmother back at the bistro working the kitchen alone. She hesitated, weighing her options. Vi took a breath and crossed her arms. If she was going to do this, she'd do it on her terms. "Make it 5 times more," she said boldly. The crowd collectively gasped. The banker looked like he might faint. Ethan arched an eyebrow. "You drive a hard bargain. I've got rent to pay." He chuckled. "4 times." 4.5, she countered without missing a beat. Ethan stared at her, amused. "Do you always negotiate this way?" "Only when my life depends on it." The room was stunned. The banker muttered in frustration. "Ethan, are you out of your mind?" But Ethan was already grinning at Ivy. "Deal." Ivy blinked. "Wait, what?" "You start tomorrow," he said. Her sentence was swallowed by a wave of whispers and laughter. She looked at him, then at her stained apron, then at the stunned partygoers. What had just happened? She came to drop off dinner and left with a job. And maybe a completely different life. The following morning, Ivy woke up still questioning her sanity. "Did I really agree to work for Ethan Hayes?" she whispered to herself. Her 70-year-old grandmother's voice floated from the tiny kitchen in their apartment above Pacific Walk Bistro. "Ivy, breakfast's on the table." She stepped out of her room to find her grandmother flipping dumplings on the stove. "So, how was your fancy delivery last night?" she asked without turning. Ivy poured herself coffee and slumped at the table. "Let's just say I spilled juice on some important banker, almost got manhandled by a security guard, and oh yeah, got hired by a billionaire." Her grandmother turned, spatula in hand. "You did what now?" Ivy sighed. "I know it's nuts. But he offered me a crazy amount. I said yes, part-time only." Her grandmother continued cooking in thoughtful silence, clearly trying to process the news. "And do you even trust this Ethan Hayes?" Ivy shrugged. "He orders our soba nearly every Friday. If he were shady, I figure he would have kidnapped me by now." Her grandmother laughed, shaking her head. "Well, then go ahead. But if he gives you trouble, you know I've still got good aim with a ladle." Ivy chuckled and grabbed her bag. "Wish me luck." Hopefully I don't burn the building down. The headquarters of Hayes and Company. Ventures looked even more daunting up close. Inside, the air was cold and sharp and people in tailored suits rushed by, busy on phones or tapping on tablets. Ivy straightened her jacket and tried to look confident. At the front desk, a perfectly poised receptionist glanced at her. "May I help you?" "I'm Ivy, Ethan's new chef." The woman gave a slow blink as if unsure she'd heard right, then picked up the phone. "Mr. Hayes, your new chef has arrived." Ivy heard a low voice respond on the other end, then the receptionist gestured to the elevator. "Top floor." Ivy swallowed her nerves and stepped in. As the elevator ascended, her anxiety did too. When the doors opened, she was met with a space that looked more like a cooking show set than a corporate kitchen. White marble counters, sleek cabinets, and a massive central island. And there was Ethan, leaning casually against the counter, arms crossed. "Took you long enough?" "I got lost 3 times on the way up, but hey, I made it." He smirked and gestured toward a neat row of ingredients. "Let's see what you've got." "You're hiring me without a trial run?" "Of course not. That'd be reckless." "So what if I mess up?" "Then I'll fire you on the spot." Ivy narrowed her eyes. This was a challenge, and she had no intention of losing. Ivy rolled up her sleeves. "All right, let's see who cracks first." She dove into the ingredients and started making a simple soba dish exactly as her grandmother had taught her. She could feel Ethan's eyes glued to her the entire time, which only added pressure. "You're staring way too hard," she muttered while tossing vegetables in the pan. "I'm analyzing your process. I'm not a science experiment, you know. Just making sure you're not poisoning me." She huffed and kept going. But her nerves got the better of her. She accidentally poured in way too much soy sauce. A strong salty scent filled the kitchen. "Oh no." Ethan tilted his head. "What now?" "Nothing," she said quickly, trying to adjust the seasoning. But the noodles were already done. He scooped up a portion, grabbed a pair of chopsticks, and tasted it. Ivy held her breath as he chewed. "Well?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, squinting. "Have you ever been swimming in the Atlantic?" Yeah." "Why?" "Because this tastes like the ocean." Ivy groaned and dropped her head in her hands. "Amazing. First day and I already screwed up." Ethan set down his chopsticks. "It's a rookie mistake. But honestly, it's still better than half the overpriced food I've tried lately." Ivy crossed her arms. "So, I pass." He chuckled. "Barely. But with one condition, don't ever drown me in soy sauce again." "No guarantees." As she wiped down the counters, a man in a navy suit walked into the kitchen without knocking. "Mr. Hayes, we need to speak." Ethan sighed and turned to Ivy. "Clean up here and meet me in my office." She nodded as they walked out, already wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Left alone in the kitchen, Ivy leaned against the counter, trying to wrap her head around the last 24 hours. Just yesterday she was juggling deliveries and now she was working in a corporate tower with a billionaire who joked about firing her over noodles. She glanced around the sparkling kitchen she had just cleaned and felt a strange sense of pride. It was surreal. She dried her hands and followed the hallway toward Ethan's office. As she approached the door, slightly ajar, she paused. Inside, she saw Ethan leaning against his desk, arms crossed, while the suited man spoke in a low, serious tone. "This is a critical phase for the merger with Lincrest Capital, Ethan. We don't have time for distractions. You hiring some street-level cook sends the wrong message." Ivy's eyes narrowed. So now she was just a distraction? Without waiting for permission, Ivy pushed open the door. "If I'm just a street-level cook, then you're just another guy in a tie. Same league, different game." The man turned toward her, surprised. "And who are you?" "Your boss's personal chef." Ethan's smirk returned. "Ivy, this is Connor, my financial advisor." Ivy looked him up and down. "Connor, huh? Great. Now you can stop referring to me like I'm some random delivery girl." Connor looked unconvinced. "Are you seriously entertaining this?" Ethan shrugged. "Her food beats any 5-star dish in the city." Ivy held her head high while Connor crossed his arms, clearly not buying it. Connor scoffed. "Then why don't you let your investors try her cooking? That'll prove whether she's worth all this." Ivy blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan tilted his head, considering. "That's not a bad idea." "Wait, what?" Connor continued. "You've got that dinner with the investors tomorrow night. Let her cook. If she impresses them, great. If not, at least I can say I told you so." Ivy shot back. "Must be nice being paid either way, huh?" Ethan chuckled. "She's got a point." Connor narrowed his eyes, but it was already decided. The challenge was on. Ivy crossed her arms. "Fine. But I get to choose the menu." Connor looked skeptical. "These are investors, not food truck regulars." They expect high-end cuisine. I wasn't hired to follow rules. I was hired because I make good food. She turned to Ethan. Right? He nodded. Exactly. Connor sighed. Just make sure no one ends up in the ER. No promises, Ivy said with a sweet smile. The next morning, Ivy arrived at Hayes & Company. Ventures early, carrying a large basket of fresh ingredients. Ethan found her unpacking in the kitchen and raised an eyebrow. You're not messing around. How many people are coming? He asked, grabbing a clementine from her basket. 6 investors plus you, so 7. But I always plan for extras. She leaned on the counter. I'm thinking something simple but unforgettable. That sounds like you. We'll start with crispy shrimp bites, then jasmine fried rice, sweet glazed beef, and finish with soba. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're seriously serving soba to millionaires? Ivy straightened. If they've got taste buds, they'll love it. He bit into the fruit and smiled. You're confident. And good, she added, grinning. As evening fell, the investors began arriving for the dinner at Hayes & Company. Ivy was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, focused on every detail. She peeked out through the glass panel and saw impeccably dressed guests murmuring politely. Among them was Connor, who glanced toward the kitchen with a smug grin. Ivy rolled her eyes. Ethan appeared beside her. Nervous? Ivy raised an eyebrow. Me? Never. He laughed. We'll see about that. One by one, the dishes made their way out to the table, each plate carefully arranged, each bite crafted with purpose. First came the shrimp bites, golden and crisp. Then the jasmine rice with scallions and fresh herbs, followed by the sweet glazed beef with a delicate hint of orange zest. Finally, the soba noodles arrived, steaming and aromatic, stirred with sautéed vegetables and a homemade sauce. The investors took their first bites with neutral expressions. Ivy watched from the kitchen, heart racing. Then something shifted. A smile. A nod. One of the guests raised a brow. I didn't expect this. Another leaned in. This soba is incredible. Connor's jaw tightened. Across the room, Ethan met Ivy's gaze and gave a quiet, satisfied smile. Ivy was stunned. She hadn't just gotten by, she'd won them over. The success of the dinner lingered in her mind as she returned the next day. The feedback had been clear, shock and delight. Her food had spoken louder than credentials ever could. But there was a side effect. Everyone at Hayes & Company now knew who she was. As she walked through the building, she felt eyes on her. Whispers floated through the halls. That's her. Isn't she the one who cooked for the investors? I heard Ethan's got a thing for her. Ivy's eyes widened. A thing? Seriously, she thought, picking up her pace. She gripped the handle of her shopping bag tighter. She needed to focus, not get caught up in rumors. But when she reached the top floor, something strange caught her eye. The counters in the private kitchen were covered with takeout boxes from Charleston's most luxurious restaurants. Tiny, ornate dishes were neatly lined up like an art gallery. Ethan stood beside them with a fork in hand, eyeing the food like it offended him. Ivy set her bag down. What is this? He sighed. Connor thinks I should refine my palate. Suggested I try cuisine from the city's top chefs. Ivy read the label on one of the containers. Maison Bellamy? That place charges $600 for food that looks like a fashion accessory. She lifted one of the gilded containers, examined the contents, and stabbed a delicate slice of meat topped with edible gold. After one bite, she grimaced. Tastes like seasoned plastic. Ethan chuckled. Finally, someone agrees with me. She scanned the table, frowning. You already had good food, you didn't need all this. He shrugged. Blame Connor. Says I lack sophistication. Ivy rolled her eyes, then unpacked her ingredients, her resolve kicking in. You want refined? I'll give you real refinement. Ethan tilted his head. You're cooking now? Just to prove a point. She shot him a grin. Exactly. She quickly prepared a bowl of fried rice with grilled chicken and her grandmother's signature garlic soy sauce. As the scent filled the kitchen, Ethan leaned in, intrigued. When she set the steaming bowl in front of him, he didn't hesitate. He picked up chopsticks, took a bite, and paused. His eyes closed briefly, then he sighed with contentment. Now that's real food. Ivy crossed her arms, triumphant. Better than the gold-dusted nonsense? He smiled. No contest. Just then, the kitchen door opened. A woman in a sleek red blazer and stilettos strolled in like she owned the building. Ethan, darling, I've been looking everywhere for you. She halted when she saw Ivy and narrowed her eyes. And who's this? Ethan took another bite before replying. Ivy, my personal chef. The woman, clearly not thrilled, laughed theatrically. A chef? Since when do you need one? Ivy caught the judgmental tone immediately. The woman scanned her, top to toe, like she didn't belong. Well, he does now, Ivy answered coolly. The woman blinked at her boldness. Ethan rubbed his forehead, clearly tired. Ivy, this is Bianca. Ivy raised an eyebrow. Ex-girlfriend? Bianca gave a coy smile. Still very much part of Ethan's life. Ivy narrowed her eyes. How lucky. Ethan sighed. Bianca, what do you want? She stepped closer and rested a manicured hand on his shoulder. Dinner at Maison Bellamy tonight. Just like old times. Ivy bit the inside of her cheek to stop from laughing. Ethan didn't even look up. I've got a meeting tonight. Tomorrow too. He glanced between them. Besides, I have my own chef now. I don't need to eat out. Bianca's smile faltered for a brief moment before she recovered. Ivy watched, amused by how unbothered Ethan seemed. Well, Bianca said, turning to Ivy with a glint in her eye, I hope you're truly talented. Because I doubt you can top Maison Bellamy. Ivy leaned against the counter. If you'd like, I can prepare something just for you. Bianca looked her up and down with disdain. Oh, sweetheart. I doubt you're capable of that. Ivy smiled. Only one way to find out. Bianca gave Ethan one last look, clearly irritated. See you later, Ethan. Then she turned and left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume. Ivy turned to Ethan. She's charming. He chuckled. That's her on a good day. Then you'll need all the luck you can get. Ivy sipped some juice and leaned on the counter, watching him finish the last bite of fried rice. Ethan was still a mystery to her. A billionaire surrounded by sharks, living in penthouses and going to galas, but here he was acting like a regular guy. And that was dangerous. Because the more human he seemed, the harder it was to remind herself this was just a job. She shook the thought from her head. It was better not to get attached. The next morning, Ivy returned to Hayes and Company, more settled into the strange rhythm of cooking for an unpredictable CEO. But as soon as she stepped into Ethan's office, she walked straight into a shouting match. This is absurd, Ethan. Connor slammed his hand on the desk. You're wasting time. Ethan, ever calm, leaned back and smiled. Sounds like a challenge to me. Ivy stood in the doorway holding her grocery bag. Am I interrupting? Connor ran a hand down his face. Tell him he's out of his mind. Ivy raised an eyebrow. What did he do this time? Ethan pointed to a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, City's top chefs compete in annual charity cook-off. He wants to enter the competition, Connor said flatly. Ivy blinked. You? As in, you personally? You want to participate? She asked, stunned. Ethan gave a casual smile. Why not? Connor groaned. Because you're a CEO, not a cook. Ivy crossed her arms. Ethan, can you even fry an egg? He looked up, thoughtful. I made instant noodles once. They were crunchy. Connor threw his hands up. Exactly. Ivy held back a laugh. Well, in that case, he'll need a good teacher. Ethan looked at her, eyes gleaming. Are you offering? She shrugged. If you promise not to burn anything or anyone. Deal. The next few days were absolute chaos. Ivy quickly learned that while Ethan might rule boardrooms, he was utterly hopeless in a kitchen. His first attempt at cooking a steak nearly ended in disaster. Why is it smoking like that? He asked, waving a towel. Because you turned the heat up to lava, Ivy snapped, grabbing the pan from his hands. On his second try, he managed to cut his finger slicing scallions. Seriously. Ivy groaned, reaching for a bandage. You're a danger to society. By lesson 3, she figured it was safest to start with a sandwich. Even that went wrong. You cannot use half a jar of mayo, Ethan. Ivy exclaimed. But I like mayo, he defended, holding the jar protectively. Connor occasionally peeked in to check their progress, usually shaking his head in silent horror. This is going to be a disaster. Ivy, however, refused to give up. He's terrible now, but he'll improve. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You really believe in me? She smirked. Not even a little. But I love a good challenge. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. The venue was packed with top chefs, media outlets, and curious foodies. Judges sat ready, eager to taste something unforgettable. Ethan, dressed in a crisp white apron, stood behind his station with what looked like misplaced confidence. Ivy watched from backstage, arms folded, a cocktail of anxiety and pride bubbling inside her. The timer started. 60 minutes. One original dish. Ethan sprang into action, grabbing ingredients with a surprising sense of focus. Ivy leaned forward, holding her breath. He chopped vegetables, still slow, but no blood this time. He stirred the sauce, no fire alarms. He plated the dish, minimal mayo. It was still far from professional, but compared to where he started, it was a miracle. When time was called, Ethan carried his plate to the judges. Ivy watched, heart pounding, as each of the 3 judges took a bite. Silence. One judge set his fork down, wiped his mouth, and looked Ethan dead in the eye. Mr. Hayes. I'll admit, the tension in the room was suffocating. This is unexpectedly delicious. Ivy exhaled in relief. Connor, watching from the sidelines, blinked in disbelief. A second judge nodded. Great balance of flavor. Nicely done. Ethan didn't win first place, but he took second. For a man who once confused cornstarch with powdered sugar, it was practically a miracle. After the event, Ethan made a beeline to Ivy, smiling like a kid who'd just aced a test. So, Chef, did I do okay? She grinned. You passed. With mild burns and dramatic flair. He stepped closer, his voice softening. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous, she joked, crossing her arms. He chuckled. What if we opened a restaurant? Ivy blinked. Wait, what? I'm serious. Your food is incredible and I actually enjoyed this whole process. We'd make a great team. She stared at him, searching for a hint of sarcasm, but he was dead serious. Her heart skipped a beat. After the event, Ivy couldn't sleep. A restaurant? With Ethan? Business partner with a billionaire? That's got disaster written all over it, she thought. But the next morning when she arrived at Hayes & Company, any lingering doubt vanished. Ethan was already in the conference room, beaming, a folder full of papers in front of him. Morning, chef extraordinaire, he said with a wink. Ivy squinted at the folder. What is this? He leaned back proudly. Ideas. Locations. Concepts. Menus. Potential names. She laughed nervously. You actually meant it? Completely. I thought it was just post-cooking adrenaline talking, Ivy admitted. Ethan shook his head. Nope. I've already started scouting locations. Ivy took a seat, still unsure whether to panic or be flattered. Ethan. I'm just a small-town cook. My grandmother taught me how to stir-fry and stretch groceries. That's it. And I'm a rich guy who nearly burned his eyebrows off boiling water. We balance each other out. She shook her head, laughing. You're insane. But charmingly so, he added. I believe that every good investment starts with passion, Ethan said. Ivy sighed and pulled a chair closer. Let's say I'm not immediately running for the door. Where exactly do you want this restaurant? He opened a map and pointed to 3 options. One in the heart of downtown Charleston, another in an upscale district, and one right near your neighborhood. She raised an eyebrow. Near my neighborhood? He nodded. It would support your community. And let's be honest, homestyle food sells itself. She narrowed her eyes. This idea yours or Connor's? Ethan laughed. Mine. Connor thinks I've lost my mind. I can see why, Ivy mumbled. Ethan leaned forward. Look, I know it's a risk. But I'm all in. She bit her lip. It's not just about me. My grandmother still runs Pacific Walk. I can't just leave her. Then bring her with us. Ivy stared at him, stunned. The answer had sounded so simple coming from him, but she'd never considered it. Wait, you're serious? She asked. Completely. You and your grandmother built something special. Why not expand it? And for the first time, Ivy wondered, maybe this wasn't so crazy after all. You make it sound so easy, Ivy said quietly. Sometimes it is, Ethan replied. She's a great cook. You are too. It could be a family-run restaurant with real heart. Ivy was speechless for a moment. Okay, but if we do this, I want equal say in every decision. Ethan nodded. Done. And no outrageous prices. I want the food to be affordable for real people. He raised an eyebrow. You're tough. She smirked. I learned from the best. As soon as she left the office, she rushed straight home. Her grandmother was folding aprons in the back of Pacific Walk when Ivy burst through the door. Grandma, you're not going to believe this. The older woman looked up calmly. Try me. Ivy sat down, catching her breath. Ethan wants to open a restaurant with me. Her grandmother's eyes widened slightly. The Billionaire? Yep. And he wants to build it near our neighborhood. The woman returned to folding, a soft smile forming on her face. And what do you want? Ivy paused. I want to do it, but only if you come with me. Her grandmother laughed gently. Sweetheart, I'm too old to open another restaurant. But I need you. You're the reason I even know how to cook. She took Ivy's hands in hers. I'll always be here for you. But it's time you built your own path. Ivy's heart swelled. Her grandmother was right. Over the next few days, Ivy and Ethan dived into planning. There were endless debates and discussions, but something about working with him made it all feel possible. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming real. I want simple food, Ivy insisted, but it has to be memorable. It also needs to stand out, Ethan countered. They went back and forth on everything from table layouts to the name of the restaurant. What about Heart and Rice? Ethan offered. Ivy scrunched her nose. Too corny. Then what would you call it? She thought for a second. What about Savory Roots? Ethan paused, then smiled. I like that. And just like that, their idea took its first real step forward. But the night before they were supposed to sign the lease, something unexpected happened. Ivy was closing up Pacific Walk when someone knocked on the door. Bianca. With a smug smile, she stepped inside without being invited. We need to talk. Ivy crossed her arms. We really don't. Bianca looked around with barely hidden judgment. So this is where you worked. Cute. Humble. Ivy rolled her eyes. What do you want, Bianca? The woman's eyes sparkled with mischief. Just a little advice, be careful. Careful with what? Ivy asked, suspicious. Bianca sighed dramatically, fixing her hair. You may think Ethan's being generous, but he never does anything without a reason. Ivy's fists clenched. And what exactly are you implying? Oh, honey, Bianca said sweetly. Once he gets bored, you'll be yesterday's news. Ivy narrowed her eyes. Funny. Seems like he got bored of you first. Bianca's face flushed with anger. Let's see how long you last, sweetheart. And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind tension and a trail of expensive perfume. The next morning, Ivy stormed into Ethan's office before he even had a chance to say hello. I hope you're not planning to back out, she said. He looked up from a pile of papers and smiled. Just signed the lease. Ivy froze. You already signed it? He held up the document. We're officially business partners. She stared at the paper, her chest tightening. There was no turning back now. It was either going to be the best decision of her life or a disaster she couldn't undo. After signing the papers, Ivy found herself walking through the future home of Savory Roots with Ethan by her side. It felt surreal. They were business partners now. But Ethan wasn't treating it like just another project. He was invested more than she expected. Every menu idea, every paint swatch, he gave it his full attention. We need a visual identity, he said one afternoon, flipping through logo mock-ups. Something sleek but warm. Modern yet cozy. Ivy stared at him. It's a restaurant, not a fintech startup. He grinned. Branding matters. She crossed her arms. Not more than the food. Before they could continue arguing about colors, Connor entered the room with a thick folder in hand. We've got a problem. Ivy groaned. Of course we do. Ethan took the folder and began flipping through it. What now? Connor's expression was flat. The property needs major repairs. More than we estimated. Ivy's eyes widened. What kind of repairs? Electrical rewiring, plumbing, and he hesitated. There was a pigeon's nest in the ventilation. Ivy placed her hands on her head, stunned. You've got to be kidding me. This can't be happening, she muttered. Ethan looked through the cost breakdown. We can handle it. It'll take time, but it's fixable. Connor folded his arms. It's also expensive. Ivy looked between them. How expensive? Connor hesitated. Ethan didn't. He grabbed a notepad, scribbled down a number, and slid it across the table. Ivy picked it up, saw the figure, and nearly fell out of her chair. Have you lost your mind? Ethan gave a calm shrug. It's a necessary investment. Ivy gawked. With that money, I could buy half the block. Connor stood quietly, clearly enjoying the show. Ivy took a deep breath, trying to stay grounded. Maybe we should look at other spaces. Ethan shook his head. This one's perfect. His tone shifted, steady, serious. Do you trust me? She froze. The room went quiet. After a pause, she exhaled. Fine. But if this restaurant fails, I'll haunt you forever. Ethan laughed. Deal. Construction began the next day. Savory Roots quickly turned into a dusty construction site. Ivy spent her days running quality checks, making sure no shortcuts were taken. And Ethan? He helped. Ethan, no. That's wall paint, not counter sealant. Are you sure? I think it adds texture. No. Connor observed from a safe distance, sipping coffee like he was watching a live sitcom. I should start charging admission. Ethan tossed a paintbrush at him, half joking, half serious. Day by day, the space began to take form. Exposed beams, warm wood, deep greens, just like Ivy imagined. The first time she walked into the nearly finished dining room, she stopped in her tracks. It was real now. She turned to Ethan, moved. This is incredible. He smiled. And this is just the start. But the next step was even harder, hiring a team. Ivy wanted to bring in people from her community, cooks who knew flavor even without degrees. Ethan, predictably, had other ideas. We need someone with experience, he said. I have experience, Ivy shot back. I mean formal training. Oh, please. You think a culinary diploma can replicate 50 years of my grandmother's recipes? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. That's not what I'm saying. Then let me build the kitchen crew. My way. He looked at her for a beat, then raised an eyebrow. You really think you can do it? She grinned. Watch me. And with that, the hunt for the perfect team began. Ivy went straight to her neighborhood the next morning. She knocked on familiar doors and called in a few old favors. Mr. Ramon, still making those killer beans? Mrs. Elena, remember when you told me you missed baking? I've got a job proposal, let's build something together. Within a few days, she had assembled a small team of local cooks and bakers, none of them classically trained, but all of them overflowing with flavor and love for food. When Ethan saw them all gathered in the restaurant, he blinked. Where did you find these people? Ivy grinned. They're the best you'll ever work with. Opening day came sooner than expected. The buzz was everywhere, people from the neighborhood, local media, and even influencers showed up to see what the hype was about. The line wrapped around the block. Inside, Ivy was running around like a whirlwind. The rice is overcooked. Who salted the sauce twice? Where's the garnish? Ethan stepped into the kitchen, calm and collected. What's going on here? Ivy wiped her forehead. Chaos. Welcome to my world. He smirked. Breathe. You've got this. She paused, then nodded. She didn't believe him, but it helped to hear it. First order, up, someone shouted. And just like that, Savory Roots was officially open. The reviews started rolling in almost immediately. Customers raved. They loved the food, the energy, the authenticity. From the dining room, Ethan watched it all unfold, guests smiling, waiters moving fast but happy, Ivy laughing between orders. Connor approached him slowly. You took a big risk, he said. Ethan didn't look away from Ivy. And it paid off. Connor smirked. It's not just about the restaurant, is it? Ethan blinked. I don't know what you mean. Connor chuckled. Sure you don't. By the time the last table was cleared, Ivy collapsed into a chair in the back, exhausted but glowing. Ethan sat beside her. Still breathing. Barely, she muttered. But you made it. She looked around, letting it sink in. The restaurant was real. And full. And loved. Her life would never be the same again. Every day after, Savory Roots was packed. Word spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with photos and rave reviews. And Ivy? She barely had time to sit. I'm officially dying, she groaned one night, slumping into a kitchen chair. Her apron was stained, her ponytail a mess. Ethan, sipping his espresso, looked far too relaxed. You wanted this, remember? I wanted a restaurant. I didn't want to turn into a zombie. He raised an eyebrow. There's an easy fix. She narrowed her eyes. What? At that moment, the kitchen door swung open and 3 new employees walked in. Ivy sat up. Who are they? Ethan sipped his coffee. Your new team. Ivy stood up. Wait, you hired people without telling me? Ethan grinned. Call it a gift. She crossed her arms. You can't make big decisions without your business partner. You were drowning in orders. I fixed it. She opened her mouth to argue, but he had a point. The new hires looked experienced and capable. And frankly, she needed help. Fine, she said. But you don't get points for being right. Ethan's grin widened. I always get points. Ivy rolled her eyes. Don't get used to it. With the new team in place, the kitchen ran smoother and faster. But with success came attention. Too much attention. Ivy, who just wanted to cook, suddenly found herself going viral. Videos of her plating dishes, telling food stories, even scolding Ethan were racking up views online. I didn't sign up for this, she groaned one morning, staring at her phone. Ethan, as usual, found it all hilarious. What's wrong now? She held up her screen. This clip has over 1 million views. He shrugged. Congrats, celebrity chef. I'm just a cook. Ivy protested. Ethan crossed his arms, clearly amused. You're a famous cook now. She rubbed her temples. I didn't want fame. I wanted a kitchen, good food, and maybe a nap. He walked over, took her phone, and glanced at the video. You know what this means? What? It means people care. They love what you do. Ivy wanted to argue, but he had a point. Again. And she hated when he had a point. The restaurant was booming. Every seat filled. Every dish devoured. But peace didn't last. One morning, Ivy walked into the kitchen and froze. Standing near the counter, heels, sunglasses and all, was Bianca. Good morning, darlings, she said sweetly. Ivy's stomach turned. Ethan, who was counting invoices near the register, frowned. What now? I just came to check in. You two have done well for yourselves. Ivy crossed her arms. You never just check in. Bianca sighed dramatically, clearly up to something. Well, since you asked. She pulled a sleek gold envelope from her designer purse. I'm hosting an exclusive charity event, and I'd love Savory Roots to cater. Ivy blinked. You want us to cook for your party? Bianca smiled. Business is business, darling. It would be excellent publicity. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What kind of event? A dinner gala. VIPs only. Politicians, CEOs, investors, big names. It'll do wonders for your little restaurant. Ivy hesitated. Something felt off. She looked at Ethan. Should we? He shrugged. It's risky. Oh, come on, Bianca interrupted, rolling her eyes. Are you always this dramatic? Ivy stared at her, weighing the pros and cons. Finally, she sighed. Fine. We'll do the catering. Bianca's eyes sparkled with triumph. Wonderful. Ethan leaned in slightly. If you try anything. Bianca raised her hands. Relax, Hayes. I'm being professional. And with that, she turned and sauntered out, leaving behind tension and a heavy trail of perfume. Ethan glanced at Ivy. You sure about this? She nodded slowly. If it helps the restaurant grow, it's worth the risk. He gave a faint smile. You're braver than I thought. Ivy smirked. And you haven't seen anything yet. In the days that followed, the team worked hard on the event menu. Ivy curated every dish and the kitchen buzzed with preparation. But when they arrived at the venue that night, something felt wrong. The waitstaff looked nervous. The event coordinators avoided eye contact. Ivy's instincts flared. Then Ethan's phone rang. He answered and went pale. What is it? Ivy asked. He looked at her, jaw tight. Bianca set us up. Her chest tightened. How? She told everyone at the gala that Savory Roots was only delivering the food. She's crediting the cooking to another catering company. Ivy's eyes widened in disbelief. She's stealing our work? Ethan nodded grimly. Basically. Ivy didn't hesitate. She stormed toward the stage, grabbed the microphone, and spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear. Good evening, everyone. Hope you're enjoying dinner. Quick note. I made it. The crowd murmured. Bianca froze at the back of the room, color draining from her face. This food wasn't made by some luxury caterer, Ivy continued. It came from Savory Roots, made by me and my team. People whispered, surprised. If you need proof, I'll cook something right now, right here. The room erupted into applause. Ivy stepped down, chin high, and returned to the kitchen like a queen reclaiming her throne. Bianca was shaking with rage. From the sidelines, Ethan watched the scene unfold and smiled. She's incredible, he thought. That night, Ivy and Ethan left the event as the unexpected stars of the show. Bianca had tried to humiliate them, but the plan had backfired spectacularly. And as news spread, Savory Roots gained even more attention. Articles popped up. Photos were shared. People started lining up outside the restaurant just to catch a glimpse of the chef who stood up with a mic. Suddenly, Ivy was a local icon. Hey, it's the Soba Queen, someone shouted at the farmer's market. Another woman approached Ivy. Will you teach me how to make the garlic sauce? Ivy smiled shyly, clutching a bag of fresh vegetables, and tried to leave unnoticed. Ethan, walking beside her with his hands in his pockets, looked far too pleased. You're getting famous. I didn't want to get famous, she muttered, tossing a tomato in the basket. And this is all your fault. He raised an eyebrow. Mine, she pointed at him. You dragged me into this billionaire circus. He laughed. Dragged you? Or did you march in on your own? She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Maybe he had a point. Back at Savory Roots, things were running so smoothly that Ethan decided to level up. I want you to cook for a private dinner, he said one morning. Ivy frowned. Define private. Business dinner. Few top executives. Small gathering. So, more rich people? He grinned. Exactly. Ivy sighed. My nerves are going to quit before I do. You'll be fine, Ethan said. The dinner was held at the rooftop of a luxury hotel in Charleston's historic district. Ivy arrived early, carrying fresh ingredients in her usual tote, already feeling out of place. I'm cooking for Millionaires. Again, she muttered. But the moment she stepped into the kitchen, she was back in her comfort zone. Flames, flavors, focus. While she prepared the food, Ethan welcomed the guests. They were impressed not only by his business portfolio but by the story of Savory Roots. "You found a gem," one of them said. "More like a firecracker," Ethan replied proudly. Dinner was served, and silence followed. The first guest took a bite, then smiled. "This is fantastic." Others nodded, murmuring their agreement. From the kitchen, Ivy peeked around the doorframe, her chest tight with nerves. But seeing the satisfied faces eased the tension. Then something strange happened. She walked back to the prep counter and saw a waiter near the sauces, unscrewing a small bottle. "What are you doing?" she asked, walking over quickly. The man froze, startled, then dropped the bottle and bolted. "Hey!" Ivy shouted. "Stop!" But he was already gone. She picked up the bottle, heart racing. The label was peeled off. Smelled wrong. Her hands trembled slightly as she rushed to Ethan. "We have a problem." He took one look at her face and stood. "Tell me." She held up the bottle. "Someone tried to put this in the food." His jaw clenched. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "He ran as soon as I caught him." Ethan took a deep breath, visibly trying to contain his anger. "I'll handle it." For the first time, Ivy saw a different side of him, cold, protective, focused. The dinner ended smoothly with the guests unaware of what had nearly happened. But Ivy couldn't shake it. Someone had tried to sabotage her cooking. Again. She sat in the kitchen afterward, her thoughts racing. What if I hadn't caught him? What if someone had gotten hurt? And she knew this wasn't over. Ethan's expression was colder than Ivy had ever seen. "I'm going to find out who's behind this." The rooftop dinner had ended without incident, but both of them were still rattled. Ivy slumped in a chair, exhausted. "I just want to sleep for a week." Ethan looked at her, and without overthinking it, gently placed his hand over hers. "You did great tonight." She blushed. "Thanks." He smiled softly. "And I think we both deserve a break." Ivy let out a breath and finally laughed. "For once, I agree with you." "Finally, a smart opinion," she teased. The next morning, though, something still felt off. Ivy arrived early at Savory Roots, trying to shake off the unease. But her thoughts kept circling back to the attempted sabotage. What if she hadn't seen that waiter? What if something had gone wrong? She walked into the kitchen and began organizing the prep area, hoping routine would calm her. Before long, Ethan showed up, face serious. "We need to talk," he said. Ivy looked up from the cutting board. "If this is about last night, I already can't sleep." He nodded. "It's about more than that." He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. Ivy stared at the headline. "Chef behind popular restaurant accused of fraud, sources question authenticity of success story." And there was her photo. "What is this?" she whispered. "I'm looking into it," Ethan said. "But someone is clearly targeting you." Ivy's face went pale. "First the food, now this?" He nodded grimly. "We expected competitors. But this, it's personal." She clenched her fists. "I've worked too hard to be called a fraud. I built this place from scratch." Ethan placed his phone on the counter. "I know. And I have an idea." Ivy narrowed her eyes. "What kind of idea?" He gave her a sly smile. "The kind where we give them exactly what they want." "Are you insane?" Ivy asked. "Maybe," Ethan said. "But trust me." She crossed her arms. "If this blows up, you're washing dishes for a month." He held up a hand. "Deal." The plan? A live cooking event. Savory Roots would open its doors to the public and press. Anyone could come and watch Ivy cook from scratch. "If they want proof," Ethan said, "we'll give them a show." Ivy bit her lip. This could go so wrong. He smiled. Or it could go very, very right. The day the event arrived and the restaurant was packed. Journalists, influencers, loyal customers, everyone was there. Ivy stood in the kitchen, staring out at the sea of cameras and phones. Ethan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Just cook like you always do." She took a deep breath and turned toward the stove. What followed was magic. Ivy moved with confidence, crafting dishes with speed, precision, and passion. Every movement was fluid, practiced. The smells, the sizzles, the colors, it was a symphony of flavor. One by one, the audience started to lean forward. Then came the applause. When it was all over, Ivy collapsed into a chair in the corner of the kitchen, drenched in sweat but glowing. "That was terrifying," she said. Ethan crouched beside her. "And brilliant." Social media exploded within hours. Headlines read, "She's the real deal, local chef shuts down rumors with style," and Ivy Quinn, the fire behind Savory Roots. Suddenly, Ivy wasn't just known, she was respected. But she also knew something else. In the world of food, business, and success, peace was never permanent. With all this attention, things are moving way too fast, Ivy said one evening, stirring her signature garlic soy sauce in the back kitchen. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And that's a bad thing?" She sighed. "I don't know. I just have a feeling something's coming." "You're being paranoid," he said with a light chuckle. "Maybe. But ever since that guy tried to sabotage the dinner, I haven't relaxed for a second." Ethan's expression shifted. "If someone's still out there, I'll find out who it is." Ivy glanced at him. "Just, don't get too involved." His reply was quiet but firm. Too late. That night, Ethan called someone he trusted, Samuel Torres, a private investigator with a sharp mind and a discreet attitude. "I need you to look into whoever's been trying to ruin Savory Roots," Ethan told him. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You're awfully invested in this restaurant drama." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Because it's not just about the restaurant." 2 days later, Samuel called back. "I found your leak." Ethan answered instantly. "Who?" There was a pause. Then, "It's Bianca." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Of course it is." Bianca hadn't gotten over being humiliated at the gala. She wanted revenge, and she had money, contacts, and no shame. "She's planning something bigger," Samuel added. "She's trying to buy the restaurant." Ethan's eyes darkened. "She's out of her mind." He found Ivy that afternoon, wiping down the counters. "We need to talk," he said. Ivy looked up. "Why does that always mean bad news?" "Bianca is trying to buy Savory Roots," Ethan said. Ivy froze mid-wipe. "What?" "She wants to shut you down. And she thinks throwing money at the problem will do it." Ivy felt heat rush to her face. "Over my dead body." Ethan smiled. "That's the spirit." But deep down, he knew Bianca wouldn't give up easily. The next morning, a sharply dressed man walked into the restaurant holding a briefcase. "Miss Quinn," he said, "Ms. Bianca Langford would like to offer you a generous deal to acquire this business." He handed Ivy a contract. She scanned the front page and laughed out loud. "She wants to buy Savory Roots?" "She believes it's a fair proposal," the man said stiffly. Ivy promptly tore the contract in half and handed it back. "Tell her I'm not for sale." The man blinked, then quietly gathered the pieces and left. Minutes later, Ethan arrived. "What did I miss?" "She tried to buy me out," Ivy said. Ethan looked at her, impressed. "And?" "I sent her packing." Ethan chuckled. "You keep surprising me." But Bianca wasn't done. The very next day, headlines exploded online. Savory Roots shut down over health code violations. Ivy's blood ran cold. "This has to be fake." Ethan grabbed the official document that had just arrived. It looked legitimate, signed, sealed, and stamped. According to the report, the restaurant was being closed until further notice. "She bribed someone," Ivy said through clenched teeth. Ethan nodded. "She's playing dirty." Ivy stood, fire in her eyes. "Then we play smarter." Ethan crossed his arms. "Let's give her the war she wants." The next morning, Ivy and Ethan marched into Charleston's health inspection department. A stone-faced man in a gray suit greeted them. "Ms. Quinn, Mr. Hayes." According to the report, Savory Roots has been shut down due to serious violations. "Based on what evidence?" Ivy asked. He handed them a folder. "Expired ingredients. Poor sanitation. Pest problems." Ivy's hands trembled as she flipped through staged photos, dusty pots, crooked labels, even a cockroach photo. "This is a setup," she said. Ethan pointed to one image. "This seasoning brand hasn't existed in 2 years." The inspector paused. Ivy stood up, fire in her voice. "This proves someone faked the evidence." The inspector let out a long sigh. "Be that as it may, the complaint is on file. We'll need to do a follow-up inspection." "When?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp. "There's a process," the inspector replied. "It could take up to 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Ivy echoed. "You're shutting down a small business over fake pictures?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "This isn't a coincidence. Bianca's pulling strings." Ivy looked at the paperwork, then at Ethan. "If we're closed for 2 weeks, we might not recover." Then Ivy's eyes lit up with an idea. "If we can't open the restaurant," she said slowly, "then we take the food to the people." The very next morning, Ivy and Ethan were back in the kitchen, prepping meals for delivery. "We'll run a pop-up delivery service," Ivy explained. "No dining room, just good food in people's hands." Ethan nodded. "Let's get social media on our side." Within hours, they had a post up. "Savory Roots comes to you. Order now. Real food. No drama. And it exploded. Orders came flooding in. Do you think this will work? Ivy asked while scrambling rice in a sizzling wok. Ethan smirked. You doubt me? Constantly. He laughed. Then prepare to be amazed. The kitchen buzzed like never before. Their small team moved fast, boxing meals, labeling bags, shouting names. It was chaos, but the best kind. Still, they both knew Bianca wouldn't stay quiet. And they were right. That evening, a new headline popped up. Closed restaurant operating illegally. Ivy stared at the screen. She has no limits. Ethan grabbed the phone from her hands. Let me take care of this. He stepped outside and called Samuel Torres. I need you to find out how Bianca is getting this info. She's always one step ahead. Ivy leaned against the prep table, frustrated. She has someone watching us. Ethan nodded. And we're going to find out who. The next morning, their chance came. One of the kitchen assistants, young, quiet, new, was caught sneaking photos of order slips and staff schedules. Ivy spotted him and rushed forward. What do you think you're doing? The guy froze. Nothing, I was just. Ethan snatched the phone from his hand. On the screen, messages to Bianca Langford. We've got him, Ethan said coldly. The assistant tried to run. Ethan blocked the door. You're not going anywhere. Talk, Ivy said. Now. The guy swallowed hard. She paid me to send updates. That's it. Just info. Ethan's voice dropped. You were spying for her. The assistant looked down, guilty. I needed the money. Then go get it somewhere else, Ivy snapped. You're done here. The young man grabbed his things and disappeared out the back. Ethan looked at Ivy. Well, now we know how she's been tracking us. Ivy exhaled. Time to turn the tables. Ethan immediately called Samuel. We've confirmed Bianca's mole. Now we go public. What do you have in mind? Samuel asked. Ethan grinned. We expose her. The next morning, a bombshell article hit the news. Socialite linked to sabotage plot against local restaurant. Included screenshots of messages, payment receipts, and the full trail back to Bianca. The backlash was swift. And Savory Roots? Suddenly, the victim turned hero in Charleston's eyes. That afternoon, Ivy and Ethan were summoned to a meeting with the Charleston Health Department. With this new information, the inspector said, adjusting his glasses, we're officially clearing Savory Roots. You're allowed to reopen immediately. Ivy's eyes filled with tears. Seriously? The inspector smiled. Seriously? Without thinking, she turned and hugged Ethan tightly. He blinked, surprised for half a second, then hugged her back just as hard. We did it. That night, when they reopened the doors, a line wrapped around the block. I can't believe this, Ivy whispered as she looked out the front window. Ethan stood beside her. Believe it. This is what happens when you don't give up. She turned to him, searching his face. There was something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Then she gave a small, nervous laugh. But if you think this means you get free food for life, think again. He grinned. Still negotiating, huh? She rolled her eyes. Always. But behind the jokes, something had shifted between them and they both felt it. Business boomed. Ivy spent her days balancing recipes, staff, and orders. Ethan handled press inquiries, numbers, and strategy. They were still opposites, but now they worked like clockwork. Only something had changed. More glances. Longer conversations. Less space between them. One afternoon, as Ivy chopped cilantro, she caught Ethan watching her again. What? She asked, not looking up. He smiled. Nothing. Just thinking you're kind of amazing. She rolled her eyes, but her cheeks turned pink. Don't start with the compliments, she warned. Too late. The truth was, their partnership had become something else. Something neither of them had expected, but both were afraid to name. One night, after close, Ethan stayed behind to help clean. You don't have to do that, Ivy said, wiping a counter. I want to, he replied simply. She paused, sensing the change in the air. Okay, what's going on? Ethan put down the cloth and turned to her. Ivy, there's something I need to say. She froze, suddenly nervous. Okay. He stepped closer, his voice low. I don't know how to say this without sounding ridiculous, so I'm just going to say it. Say what? I think I'm falling for you. The words hung in the air like steam from a boiling pot. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. She stared at him, stunned. You're kidding, right? She said. Ethan shook his head. I'm not. She turned away, overwhelmed. Ethan, we're business partners. We've built something real here. This could ruin it. I know, he said. But pretending I don't feel this way is worse. She leaned against the counter, her thoughts racing. One part of her wanted to run. Another part didn't want to leave that kitchen at all. He didn't say anything else. He just waited. Finally, she turned to face him. Why now? Because after everything we've been through, he said, I realized something. I don't just care about this place. I care about you. She bit her lip. This could get messy. Or, he said gently, it could be the best thing we've ever done. Ivy stared at him, caught in the space between fear and hope, and she didn't have an answer yet. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Ivy finally whispered, I don't know what to say. Ethan stepped a little closer. You don't have to say anything right now. She looked at him, her heart pounding. But I can't pretend this didn't happen. He nodded. I get it. Take your time. She appreciated that he wasn't pushing her. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was her move. Ivy took a shaky breath. Let's just keep running the restaurant. For now. Deal, Ethan said softly. The next few days felt different. Ivy threw herself into work, focusing on the food, the staff, the schedules, anything to avoid thinking about that conversation. But Ethan was always around. Helping. Watching. Smiling in that annoying, charming way. One afternoon, Ivy's grandmother stopped by Savory Roots, bringing a small tin of sesame cookies. You look distracted, Mija, she said, eyeing Ivy's nervous chopping. Ivy sighed. It's complicated, Grandma. Her grandmother raised an eyebrow. Does it have anything to do with that nice young man? Ivy froze. How do you know? Her grandmother chuckled. I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you pretend not to notice. Ivy blushed. It's just, we work together. It's messy. The old woman shrugged. So is life. Doesn't mean you shouldn't give it a chance. Ivy spent the rest of the day thinking about those words. Maybe it was time to stop overthinking and start listening to what her heart was really telling her. That night, she stayed late again. Ethan appeared with 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for himself. No kitchen disaster today, he joked. Miracle, she said with a tired smile, taking a sip. They sat together quietly, the soft hum of the cooler the only sound in the room. After a while, Ivy spoke. I've been thinking about what you said. He looked at her, cautious but hopeful. Yeah, she nodded. I'm not ready for anything big, but I don't want to run from it either. Ethan smiled. Then we'll take it slow. Ivy was surprised by how easily he said it. You're okay with that? For you, he said, yeah. And just like that, something changed between them. No labels. No pressure. Just possibility. The restaurant kept thriving, and so did their connection. They still bickered over prep and plating. They still had wildly different opinions on marketing. But now, their arguments ended with shared smiles instead of eye rolls. One evening, as they locked up, Ivy turned to him. You know, she said, you're not as terrible as I thought you were. Ethan laughed. And you're even better than I imagined. Don't let it go to your head. Too late. He was already smiling like he'd won something. And maybe he had. Because as the weeks passed, Savory Roots became more than a restaurant. It became a symbol of community, resilience, and something unexpected, love. They didn't talk about what they were. They didn't need to. Late-night cleanup became their quiet time. Morning deliveries became small adventures. Even arguing over the placement of the new soup station felt like home. One day, Connor stopped by and caught them debating ginger versus lemongrass. You two are something else, he said, watching them like a sitcom audience. Ivy looked up. What's that supposed to mean? Connor shrugged. Just never thought a billionaire and a delivery girl would work this well. Ethan grinned. Life's full of surprises. Ivy nudged him. Like you learning how not to burn toast? They all laughed. The restaurant was thriving. The team was strong. Ivy and Ethan were still figuring it out, but it worked. No one needed grand declarations. The shared glances, the late-night talks, the teamwork, that was enough. One evening, they sat outside Savory Roots, watching the sun dip behind the Charleston rooftops. I can't believe we made it this far, Ivy whispered. Ethan looked at her. I can. You're unstoppable. She smiled. We're unstoppable. They sat there in comfortable silence, the warm lights of Savory Roots glowing behind them. Then Ivy smirked. So, what's next? Another restaurant? Food empire? World domination? Ethan laughed. I was thinking something a little simpler. Like what? Dinner. Just you and me. No customers. No staff. She raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me out? He shrugged, smiling. Maybe I am. Ivy looked at him for a long second, then smiled. Then maybe I'll say yes. They stood up together and walked back inside, side by side, as if it had always been that way. No cameras. No drama. Just two people who had fought like hell to build something together. Savory Roots buzzed softly in the background, the scent of ginger and garlic still lingering in the air. For once, there were no scandals, no rivals, no headlines. Only peace. And the promise of something real. And so the girl who once spilled juice on a banker, and the man who once thought instant noodles counted as dinner found something they hadn't expected. Partnership. Purpose. Love. Not perfect. Not easy. But real. And that made all the difference. The end.